My name is Felicity Hart. I'm 42. I spent 20 years serving in the United States Air Force, most of them decoding Russian signals in rooms without windows. I can tell you the difference between a real Moscow accent and a staged one with less than 3 syllables. But nothing prepared me for what happened at my father's wedding. It was supposed to be a quiet ceremony, low-key, second chances, close friends only. The church was filled with white lilies, soft piano music, and polite smiles. My 11-year-old son Gabe was sitting next to me, tie slightly crooked, gripping something small in his jacket pocket. I hadn't asked about it. When the officiant said, "If anyone objects to this union," I didn't expect anything. No one ever says anything. It's just a line. But Gabe stood up. He walked forward, past rows of confused guests, and stopped right in front of my father. He pulled the small device out of his pocket and held it in both hands like it was something sacred. "Grandpa," his voice was calm, clear, "don't marry her." Whispers broke out behind me. Gabe looked at my father, then added, "I found this in your office. It was hidden in the drawer behind your old passports." My father, Richard Hart, retired military doctor, gray-haired, proud, chuckled awkwardly. "Buddy, now's not the time to play detective." But Gabe pressed the button. A voice emerged from the device, female, cold, in Russian. "Он подозревает, но уже подписал. После свадьбы 3 дня, чтобы перевести деньги. С той солдаткой разберусь потом." He's suspicious, but he already signed. After the wedding, we have 3 days to transfer the money. I'll deal with that soldier girl later. The bride froze. The guests looked around in confusion. My father turned to me, pale. What did she just say? I knew every word. My blood ran cold. She wasn't talking about a soldier. She was talking about me. I didn't speak. I reached into my clutch, pulled out my phone, and tapped a contact labeled with nothing but a red dot. One quiet call, no words spoken, just a signal. I slipped the phone back into my bag. 10 minutes, that's all it would take. Behind me, guests began murmuring louder. Anastasia, the bride, tried to laugh it off. "It's some prank, it's not even my voice." But my father wasn't laughing. He stared at her now with different eyes. Gabe had stepped back beside me, and I took his hand. The piano music had stopped. The silence was heavier than anything I'd ever felt in a war zone. Exactly 10 minutes later, 3 men entered the church. Suits, badges, no hesitation. Interpol. One of them spoke quietly to the officiant and then turned toward us. They didn't shout. They didn't ask permission. They walked straight to the bride. And everything that followed changed not just the wedding, but the rest of our lives. I didn't expect my son to stop a wedding. I didn't expect the woman my father loved to be part of an international scam. And I didn't expect that 20 years of military intelligence work would come crashing back into my personal life over cake and champagne. But that's how truth works. It waits for the most public moment to explode. Let me go back. After my mother passed, my father wasn't the same. The man who used to play jazz records and build model planes in the garage suddenly stopped talking about the future. He sold the house, downsized, and stopped smiling with his eyes. Then came Anastasia. He met her at a veterans support hike. She was graceful, young for her age, with a tragic backstory. Lost her family in Latvia, worked her way through nursing school, spoke 4 languages, played the piano. Too perfect. The first time we met, she complimented my necklace in flawless English. Then asked Gabe if he wanted voda, water, in Russian. It was subtle. Most wouldn't catch it, but her intonation, it wasn't Latvian. It wasn't even Baltic accented. It was Muscovite, sharp, educated, and buried under a practiced smile. I didn't say anything then. Instead, I started watching. She never slipped again. Her accent remained crisp, her charm constant. My father was enchanted. He lit up when she entered a room. For the first time since Mom died, he danced again. I wanted to believe it was real. I wanted Gabe to see his grandfather happy again. So I waited. Until the morning Gabe found the device. He came into my room, eyes wide, lips tight. "I think it's hers," he said, holding out the small recorder. It was stuffed in the back of Grandpa's desk drawer. I pressed play. The audio was broken, just fragments. but the voice was unmistakably Russian, one phrase repeated in a lower whisper. After the wedding, we moved fast. I looked at Gabe. I'll handle this, I said. But he didn't believe me, and maybe he shouldn't have. Because I hesitated. Not because I didn't trust what we found, but because my father deserved to see it himself. If I intervened too early, he would call it paranoia, Cold War habits, overprotectiveness. I had no solid proof, just instinct. So I waited. But Gabe didn't. That morning before the wedding, he asked me again if we were going to stop it. I said, "Not yet." He nodded like he understood. But he tucked the recorder into his jacket pocket anyway. And when the time came, when the officiant said that one line that no one ever interrupts, Gabe made the call I was too afraid to make. He stood up. He told the truth. And I listened. I let the weight of it settle before I acted. I gave the enemy room to hang herself. Because when she laughed it off, when she called it a prank, she revealed what no evidence could. Arrogance. And that's all I needed. So I made the quiet call, not to the police, not to local authorities, to Interpol. Because I knew this wasn't just a personal betrayal. It was something bigger. I'd seen this profile before, the chameleon widow, the language slip, the legal name that never appears on any real registry. And when the agents arrived, calm, coordinated, fast, I didn't feel rage. I didn't even feel victory. I felt something deeper, relief. Not because I was right, but because Gabe wasn't left wondering whether he'd done the wrong thing. He knew. And so did everyone else in that church. This wasn't just a ruined wedding. It was a moment when truth didn't need to scream. It just pressed play. After my mother passed away, my father became a quiet version of the man we knew. Not broken, not angry, just hollow. He stopped humming jazz in the kitchen. He stopped fixing the clock on the mantel, even though it ran 6 minutes slow. He sold the house they built together, said it was too big. He moved into a smaller cottage near Lake Forest, where the mail arrived late and no one asked questions. It was like watching a room dim over time, not darkness, just less and less light. Then came Anastasia. She entered quietly, like background music, barely noticeable until you realized the silence was gone. He met her at a support hike for widowed veterans. I remember the day he told me. We were sitting on his porch, sharing lukewarm tea. He mentioned her casually, like he was describing a neighbor. She asked me if I needed help with my laces, he said. I told her I'd been tying boots since before she was born. Then he smiled. A real one. The kind that reached his eyes. I hadn't seen that smile in almost 4 years. Her name was Anastasia Volkova. Born in Latvia, she said. Moved to the U.S. after nursing school. Her English was perfect, fluent but gentle, with a hint of something northern in the vowels. She started showing up more and more, not all at once. First, a photo with her in the background. Then an invite to brunch. Then she brought pierogi to Gabe's birthday. My father, he changed. He started wearing shirts that didn't have coffee stains. He got a new record player and filled it with Russian classical composers, Tchaikovsky, Rachmaninoff, Shostakovich. He even joined a flower arranging class at the community center. He said it helped him feel useful again. Gabe didn't know what to make of it. He was 11, old enough to notice things, too young to name them. Is Grandpa getting married? He asked one night. Maybe, I said, folding his laundry. She makes him happy, Gabe frowned. She talks funny. She's from another country. No, not funny like that. I mean, she says things in weird ways, like she's trying to sound nice, but really she's watching everything. That made me pause. Just listen, okay? I told him. Don't react too fast. Just listen. He nodded. But I could see his shoulders tense. Gabe had inherited my instincts. He picked up on energy before words, and truth be told, I was starting to feel the same way. It wasn't that Anastasia was doing anything wrong. That was the problem. She was doing everything right. She complimented my father's choice of wine. She offered to help clean up even before dinner was over. She called Gabe sweetheart, but never tried too hard. It was polished, seamless, too seamless. One night, she and I were alone in the kitchen while the dishes soaked. Gabe was upstairs finishing homework. My father had gone out to pick up dessert. She handed me a glass of red wine. You must worry a lot, she said softly. I raised an eyebrow. About what? She tilted her head. About your father, about Gabe, about people's intentions. There was no accusation in her tone, just observation. I took a sip. I used to work intelligence. It's a habit. She smiled. I understand. I used to work in a hospital. I look at people's hands first. You look at their eyes. She turned away to rinse a plate. And I remember thinking, that was too smooth. Too quick to find common ground. Too rehearsed. Still, I said nothing. Because even if something felt off, she was making my father laugh again. And that was something no one else had done in years. But then there were the words, the tiny, quick slips. Like when she reached for water and called it voda, the Russian word, not Latvian. Or when she mentioned visiting the motherland, but didn't say which one. It wasn't enough to confront her. Not yet, but enough to keep listening. One afternoon, I found her humming a Soviet-era lullaby in the kitchen. When she saw me, she switched to a jazz tune. That night, I searched her name through every database I still had access to. There were hits, some public, some hidden, but none conclusive. Still, I didn't warn my father. Because sometimes love makes people see what they need. And I didn't want to be the soldier who took hope away from a man who had already lost too much. So I watched. I waited. I stayed still. But Gabe didn't. And in the end, he was the one who saw what I almost missed. Because Anastasia hadn't just slipped into our lives. She'd studied us first, and that was when I stopped smiling too. The call came on a Thursday afternoon. My father's voice was steadier than usual. Felicity, he said, I've decided to marry Anastasia. I didn't flinch, didn't question. Just sat in my car outside the grocery store and said, okay. There was a pause, long enough to feel his anticipation through the line. Okay, he echoed. I mean it, I said. You deserve to be happy. And I did mean that, mostly, but the tightness in my chest didn't go away. It stayed, like a rope quietly pulling inward. They set the date for mid-spring, a garden wedding. Small, private, elegant. I offered to help, but Anastasia had already taken care of most of it. She was efficient, always 2 steps ahead. That's when things started shifting fast. She began moving things into his house. Not just toiletries or spare shoes, but documents, insurance files, investment folders, utility accounts. At first, it looked like normal merging of lives. But when I dropped Gabe off one afternoon and went to refill the printer ink for my father, I noticed something strange. The life insurance paperwork was sitting openly on his desk. The coverage had been changed, recently. The original beneficiary was listed as Gabriel Hart, grandson. Now it had been replaced with Anastasia Volkova, fiancé. There was a handwritten note from the advisor, confirming the change of beneficiary and the doubling of the policy's value. It was signed and dated the previous week. I sat back in his desk chair, the soft leather creaking beneath me. I didn't touch anything, didn't take pictures. I just read it twice, let the numbers settle in my head, and walked out. It wasn't just the insurance. My father's savings account, once healthy and never touched, had begun showing consistent withdrawals. Small enough not to alarm him, regular enough to worry me. I asked him casually over lunch, "You remodeling something?" "No," he replied, chewing slowly. "Why?" "Just noticed you've been going to the bank more often." He smiled, a little sheepishly. "Anastasia's helping with the wedding. I told her she could manage some of the vendors directly. She's better at that stuff than I am." I nodded. "You trust her?" "With my life," he said. That was when I stopped eating, because love is blind, but trust is deaf. At home, Gabe had gone silent. He used to joke about Grandpa's new lady, called her Ms. Russia with a grin, but lately he'd withdrawn. When she arrived at our place with my father for dinner one night, Gabe disappeared into his room and pretended to sleep through the meal. After they left, I went to tuck him in. He stared up at the ceiling and said, "Why do people change when someone smiles at them?" I sat on the edge of the bed. "What do you mean?" "Grandpa used to laugh at dumb jokes. Now he just stares at her." "She makes him feel seen, maybe." Gabe shook his head. "She doesn't even like his jokes." Then he rolled over, pulling the covers tight. He didn't say another word, but I stayed there for a while. long enough to hear his breathing soften into sleep. That night, I walked into my office, locked the door, and opened a secure drive I hadn't used in years. It was time to stop feeling and start thinking. I ran Anastasia's name through a handful of public registries. Nothing popped up, no criminal record, no financial red flags. Her address history matched what she told us. She had a valid nursing license, active in 3 states, but the background was too clean. People carry scratches, imperfections, gaps. Hers was polished, wrapped in ribbons. I dug deeper, used an old contact in Army Intel to cross-check name variations, middle names, maiden names. No obvious matches, but a flag popped on an encrypted bulletin used for international fraud alerts. A reference to a suspected Russian national with forged Latvian documents, female, early 40s, often targeting widowed male veterans in the EU and Canada. No arrests, just a trail of vanishing assets. The codename attached was Zoya. I leaned back, staring at the name. Zoya. I didn't know if it was her. I couldn't prove it, but the shape of things was changing fast. I remembered a phrase my old commanding officer used to say. If a pattern's too neat, it's because someone tied it that way. I told no one, not yet, because suspicions without evidence are just noise, and noise only makes the truth harder to hear. Instead, I waited, watched, and my son did the same. One evening, I came home and saw Gabe bent over my father's desk. He had a tiny device in his hand, one of those kid-sized spy gadgets you find in novelty stores. He looked up, startled. "I wasn't breaking anything," he said. "I just thought maybe." I raised an eyebrow. "Maybe what?" He hesitated. "She talks weird when no one's around." He held up the device. "I just wanted to know what she really says." My heart clenched. I should have stopped him, told him it wasn't his job, but I didn't. Instead, I knelt down and looked him in the eye. "Then you listen, but don't judge. Not yet. Understand?" He nodded, serious beyond his years. And that's when I realized something chilling. The only reason Anastasia hadn't fooled all of us was because my 11-year-old son refused to stop listening. It was a rainy Tuesday when Gabe came into my room without knocking. He held something small in his hand, closed in his fist like it was a fragile insect. I sat up straight, instinct kicking in before reason could catch up. "Where did you get that?" I asked, calm but firm. He opened his hand slowly. It was a tiny voice recorder, cheap but functional, with a single red button and a cracked screen. I recognized it. My father had kept a few in his study to dictate letters back when he still used paper more than screens. "I found it in Grandpa's desk," Gabe said, "in the back drawer, tucked under the envelopes." My first reaction was protective, not about the device, about Gabe. "Did he see you take it?" He shook his head. "He was watering the orchids. She was with him." "She?" He didn't have to say it. Anastasia. I reached for the device and turned it over in my hand. The tape was still inside. It was old, slightly frayed. I looked at him. "Did you listen?" He hesitated, then nodded. "A little." "How much is a little?" "I stopped when I heard Russian. I thought maybe you should hear it first." That stopped me cold. "Russian?" He nodded again, slower this time. "Not much. Just a few words, but it didn't sound like she was reading poetry." I connected the device to my laptop using an adapter I hadn't touched since 2015. The software was clunky, but it loaded. I scrubbed through the static. Then I heard it. A woman's voice, controlled, precise, Russian accent, but native. Eastern Moscow region if I had to guess. The first part was choppy, but then it clicked into clarity. "After the wedding, we have 3 days to secure the transfer. I will handle the old soldier's daughter if she gets in the way." Then silence, a thump. As if the device had been dropped, or someone entered the room. The audio stopped abruptly. I stared at the screen, then at Gabe. He was sitting on the edge of my chair, lips pressed into a thin line. "Do you know what she said?" he asked. "I do," I answered. I didn't elaborate. Not yet. Because the worst thing you can do to a child is give them a truth they can't hold. "She's not who she says she is she?" Gabe asked, almost in a whisper. I didn't answer that either. Instead, I turned off the screen and wrapped my hand around the recorder. We don't say anything to Grandpa. Not yet. But he's going to marry her. I know, I said. And we're going to let him, for now. Gabe looked at me like I had lost my mind. Why would we let him marry someone who's dangerous? I paused, weighing my next words. Because if we stop him now, she disappears before we can prove anything. And then she'll just do it again. To someone else. And maybe next time, no one will be watching. He went quiet, then asked, So, we wait? We wait, I confirmed. But we don't stop listening. Over the next few days, we became shadows in our own lives. I coached Gabe quietly on how to observe without reacting. It wasn't just for his sake. It was the way I'd been trained years ago when surveillance meant more than just cameras. It meant instinct. Silence. Trusting your gut but not acting until it was time. He was a natural. At dinner one night, Anastasia told a story about her cousin's wedding outside of St. Petersburg, slipping into a detail so specific about the church architecture that even my father looked surprised. Have you been back recently? He asked. She smiled. Not since the pandemic, but I remember it perfectly. Then she turned to me. You've been to Russia, haven't you, Felicity? She always said my name in full. Never flick, never fell, just Felicity. I nodded. Only briefly. Estonian border. Her eyes flickered, just for a moment. Then she smiled. Ah, Narva? I returned the smile. Silame, actually. She paused her wineglass mid-air. That wasn't a tourist town. It was a former Soviet uranium processing site. I saw the tiniest ripple of calculation in her face before she recovered. You must have been with a humanitarian group. I was with the army, I said, voice steady. Communications. My father chuckled, missing the tension. Don't let her fool you, Anna. My daughter's fluent in 3 languages and can break down a signal tower with a wrench and a hairpin. Anastasia smiled at him, but I watched her fingers curl slightly around her fork. That was the first time I knew she feared me. And that meant we were finally making progress. But I also knew the recording wasn't enough. It wasn't full. It didn't name the bank. It didn't name her contacts. It didn't even refer to my father directly. Just the wedding, just the vague threat against me. Enough to raise suspicion, not enough to hold up. That night, Gabe knocked on my door again. I think we missed something, he said. Climbing up beside me on the couch, I raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? He held up a spiral-bound notebook. It was one of my father's gardening logs. He kept them religiously, cataloging which orchids bloomed when and under what conditions. Gabe opened to a page near the back. She wrote something in here, he said. It's in pencil, then erased, but if you tilt it, look. He held it under the lamp. I leaned in. Sure enough, indentations, Russian cursive. I read slowly, tracing the words aloud in English. Zoya, Monday, confirm, lawyer. Swiss vault access, confirmed. Use name from Riga Hotel. My throat went dry. Zoya. The same alias from the fraud alert database. And a Swiss vault? A lawyer? Gabe looked up at me. Is it her? I nodded. It's her. But we still needed more. Don't confront her, I told him. No matter what happens. He looked hurt. I'm not a baby. I touched his shoulder. No, you're not. That's why I'm trusting you with this. He looked down, then back up. I'll wait, but can I keep the recorder? Just until after the wedding, I hesitated, then handed it back. You press that button only when it counts. He nodded once. I'll know when. And that was the moment I stopped worrying about whether Gabe could handle the truth. He already was. I should have known Gabe wouldn't sit still for long. He had always been observant, but now that observation had sharpened into something else. An alertness that didn't quite belong to an 11-year-old. It worried me, not because he was wrong, but because he was so determined to be right. 3 days after we reviewed the recording, Gabe came home from school and went straight to the kitchen window. From there, he had a perfect view of the garden path and the back porch, where Anastasia liked to make her calls. I watched from the doorway as he crouched behind the curtain, notebook in hand. Homework? I asked casually. He didn't even flinch. In a bit. She's out there now. She who? He glanced up at me, deadpan. Her. I walked over and knelt beside him. Sure enough, Anastasia stood outside in her long, elegant coat. a scarf around her neck even though it was 70 degrees. Her phone was pressed tightly to her ear. Her lips moved quickly, too quickly for casual English. I slid the window open just a crack. "Sergey," she said, then switched to Russian. Her tone was clipped, urgent. I caught a few fragments. Vault ... Monday. Secondary name. And then, "She's suspicious." My blood turned cold. Gabe scribbled in his notebook. He was writing the time, the date, what she wore, how long the call lasted. It was methodical, clinical, more structured than some of the briefings I used to read. "She said his name again," he whispered to me. "Sergey, same as the guy from the notebook." I nodded, gently pulling the curtain back over the window. "How often does she go out there?" "Every day," he said, "between 4 and 5. "You've been watching that long?" He gave a half shrug. "Since you told me to observe." "So I did." There was no pride in his voice, no showboating, just fact. That night, after he went to bed, I took the notebook into my room and sat with it for hours. There were pages, entire pages, of details. Timestamps, overheard phrases, drawings of where people were standing. He had even mapped out the layout of the backyard, noting how sound carried depending on the wind direction. One note stood out. 4:43 p.m. She said, "If he sees the papers before the 14th, we're done." Then laughed. It was dated 2 days ago. I closed the notebook and stared at the ceiling. I'd been careful not to make him feel like he was part of something dangerous, but he was, and he knew it. Worse, he was acting like he had to fix it himself. The next morning, he slipped the notebook into my bag before I could say anything. I looked at him. "You want me to take this?" He nodded. "In case something happens." "Gabe, I'm not scared, Mom, but you should have it." There was a new hardness in his eyes, one that didn't belong to a child. Later that day, I sat with my father on the porch while he pruned his roses. He looked lighter lately, relaxed, as if the gray had stopped creeping in for just a moment. Anastasia was inside baking something that smelled like cinnamon and secrets. "Dad," I said carefully, "do you ever worry she's too perfect?" He laughed. "That's the problem, isn't it? You spend enough years with grief, and when joy shows up, it feels suspicious." "She didn't come out of nowhere," he clipped a stem. She showed up in my hiking group, started with a twisted ankle, ended with Russian cookies and blooming orchids. I wanted to scream. Not because he wasn't listening, but because I knew he was. He just didn't want to believe it. That night, Gabe came to me again. He didn't have the recorder this time, just a look in his eyes. "If we don't do something," he said, "he's going to lose everything, his money, his house, you." "Gabe, it's not that simple." "Yes, it is." He gripped the edge of the table. "She's lying, and I think he knows. He just doesn't want to say it." His voice cracked. "I saw her burning papers in the fire pit this morning." I froze. "What kind of papers?" "I don't know, but she looked over her shoulder twice, like she thought someone was watching." "Were you?" He nodded once. I felt a mixture of terror and awe. He wasn't just watching, he was tracking her, like a scout in the field. I leaned in. "Gabe, listen to me very carefully. I don't want you near her unless I'm there, understand?" He hesitated, then nodded. "I mean it. Not even to listen, not even to watch. From now on, your job is to tell me. That's it." His eyes brimmed. "But what if?" "No, what if? You've done enough, more than enough." I held his shoulders. "You are not responsible for what happens next. That's my job." "But I started it," he whispered. "No," I said. "You saw what most people miss. That's not starting trouble. That's seeing the truth." He looked down. "She scares me." I pulled him into a hug. "She should. That means your instincts are working." That night, after he fell asleep, I sat beside his bed and stared out the window. Anastasia was in the garden again, but this time, she wasn't on the phone. She was staring straight at the house. I couldn't prove it, but I knew. She was staring at Gabe's window. And I knew right then, I couldn't wait either. The music had stopped mid-phrase. All eyes were on Gabe as he stood at the front of the aisle, holding that small black recorder like it was a detonator. And in a way, it was. "Grandpa," he repeated, his voice shaking but clear. "Don't marry her. I found this in your office." He pressed the button, a click, then static. Then, the voice that came through wasn't familiar to anyone in the room. But it was to me, a woman's voice. Crisp, cold, calculated. "We have 3 days after the wedding to transfer the funds. I'll handle the soldier woman if she interferes." The recording cut. A stunned silence followed. Guests froze mid-breath. Someone dropped a glass. I heard it shatter in the background, like punctuation to a sentence no one had expected. I didn't move. Neither did Anastasia. My son had just detonated the truth. I was Felicity Hart, 43, former military intelligence, a specialist in Russian signal interception. I'd spent years learning to pick up what others miss, the tone under the words, the truth behind the silence. And at that moment, it was silent enough to hear every heartbeat in the chapel. My father turned toward me slowly. "What did she say?" His voice cracked around the edges. I didn't answer with words. I didn't have to, because in that instant, he knew, not the specifics, not the names, but he knew that whatever Gabe had just played, I understood it. Every single word. He looked into my eyes. I didn't look away. I reached into my clutch, slid my fingers across the slim black rectangle, and tapped the screen once. A silent signal. Pre-coded, pre-authorized. A habit from older days, still embedded in my muscle memory. I didn't say anything. I didn't rise. I didn't confront. Because the moment you speak, they have something to fight against. But silence is terrifying. And Anastasia felt it. I saw her chest rise faster. Her eyes flick between me and the door. Between me and Gabe. Between me and her handbag. She expected yelling, accusation, drama. She wasn't prepared for stillness. That's when her face changed. It didn't crumble, not yet, but the corners of her perfect composure twitched. Her lips tightened into a barely perceptible line. Her fingers curled against her dress. She knew she wasn't facing a jealous daughter. She was facing a soldier who'd gone quiet. Gabe looked back at me, unsure now, as if realizing the weight of what he'd done. I gave him a single nod. That was all he needed. My father was shaking. He didn't yell at Gabe. He didn't look at Anastasia. He just sat down, slowly, like his knees couldn't carry what his heart had just learned. "Felicity," he murmured again. "What was that?" I still didn't speak. Instead, I stood up. Walked forward, not to the altar, not to Anastasia, but to Gabe. I placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "You did well," I whispered. He looked up at me, his lip trembling. "Is she going to hurt you?" "Not anymore." Behind us, someone in the back murmured, "Is this part of the wedding?" A laugh tried to break through, nervous and shallow. It died in the silence, and then, the doors opened. 3 men and 1 woman stepped inside. Not in tuxedos, not in church clothes, dark suits, subtle pins at the lapels, eyes that scanned like infrared beams. Interpol. Anastasia stood frozen. She didn't run. That would have been foolish. She didn't scream. That would have been pointless. She did something far worse. She smiled. It was a slow, calculated curve, like someone folding a page before closing a book. "Well," she said, in flawless English, "I suppose this was inevitable." The officers approached. One spoke into a small mic on his wrist. Another reached gently for her handbag. She didn't resist, didn't flinch. She looked at my father as they cuffed her. And then she spoke in Russian. "You're not as stupid as I thought," she said, nodding toward me. "But your heart will always be your weakness." My father blinked, confused. I responded in the same language, voice low but steady. "Your mistake was thinking I'd stay silent." She was escorted out, head held high, but I knew the look in her eyes. She wasn't afraid of prison. She was afraid of exposure, of the secrets coming to light, of the trail she thought she buried suddenly dug up. By an 11-year-old and his mother who knew how to listen. Once the doors shut behind them, murmurs erupted. My father stood slowly, face pale. He turned to me. "How long?" I didn't answer. Because the truth wasn't about time. It was about instinct. And that instinct had just saved his life. And ours. They didn't come in with sirens or drawn weapons. That would have caused panic. They came in like they belonged, 3 plainclothes officers from Interpol, moving with silent precision, coordinated purpose. I recognized 2 of them from my years abroad. The third I didn't know, but they all had the same gait, controlled, unfazed, like wolves that had smelled blood long before the prey knew it was bleeding. The guests instinctively parted, unsure whether to stay seated or to leave. Whispers grew like wildfire. Is this a prank? Is this legal? Who called them? I stayed where I was, hand still resting on Gabe's shoulder. My son leaned closer to me, heart racing. But his eyes were locked on Anastasia. No, Irina. Because that was her real name. The lead officer walked straight to her without even acknowledging the rest of the room. He pulled out a slim leather folder, opened it to reveal a badge and a photo. Irina Vlasenko, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. You are under arrest for transnational fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to exploit elder estates across 4 jurisdictions. The silence that followed was total. Then, no, my father gasped. She didn't deny it, didn't scream, didn't try to play confused. She just looked at him, at Richard Hart, my father, and said with a trace of that silky Russian accent she had tried so hard to bury, "You were the easiest one." The air was vacuumed from the room. Several guests audibly gasped. My aunt clutched her pearls, as if that could stop her from hearing more. The officers didn't wait. One cuffed her wrist behind her back. Another retrieved a USB drive from her handbag. The third officer, tall and silent, simply observed, his eyes never leaving her face. My father took a step back, stumbling. I moved instantly to support him, one arm under his shoulder. His breath was ragged. This isn't real. I lowered my voice. Dad, it's real. Her name isn't Anastasia. She's wanted in at least 3 countries. And Gabe. Gabe was the one who gave us the clue. I thought that last part might give him some sense of pride, some grounding. It didn't. He stared straight ahead, not at Irina now, but at the memory of her, every dinner, every smile, every hand she placed over his. She said she loved me, he whispered. She said a lot of things, I replied gently. Irina turned back just once as they began to escort her toward the door. To be fair, she said in Russian, her voice cruelly casual, I only needed you to say it back. My father flinched as if slapped. I responded, also in Russian, flat and cold. Your mistake wasn't the con. It was underestimating a boy who listens. The guests were frozen. Some were already filming, discreetly, phones lowered by their knees. Others just sat in stunned silence, unwilling to process the shattering of a fantasy they'd all believed. As the officers passed me, one nodded, just a fraction of acknowledgement. I nodded back. Nothing more needed to be said. Once the doors closed, it was as if the room deflated. The music had long stopped. The flowers, once fresh and fragrant, now felt artificial. The chandelier flickered slightly overhead. My father sat back down. He didn't look at anyone, just stared at the space where Irina had stood, like he was trying to re-watch a scene he now knew was fake. I knelt beside him. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner, I said, voice quiet, level. He didn't answer right away, just kept shaking his head, whispering to himself. God, oh God. He looked up finally, his eyes meeting mine. Did you know all along? I shook my head. I had suspicions, but nothing concrete. Not until Gabe found the recorder. His face broke. My grandson saw what I couldn't. There was shame in his voice, a kind of grief no one had prepared him for, not over the woman, but over himself, over what he had let happen. She said all the right things, he muttered. She cooked the food I liked, read the books I loved. She even bought me that old Tchaikovsky record I'd mentioned once. How did she know that? She researched you, I said, calm but firm, the way any predator does. He leaned forward, burying his face in his hands. I thought, after your mother, I thought I was dead inside. And then this woman walks in, makes me laugh again, makes me feel needed. I was ready to give her everything. And that's exactly what she wanted. He looked at me then, a flicker of anger and pain. Why didn't you tell me everything the moment you suspected? Because you were in love, I said. And when someone's in love, they don't hear logic. They don't see facts. They only see hope. I paused, then added gently, And because she was dangerous. If she had known you were warned, it might have made things worse. For you. For Gabe. He exhaled sharply, closed his eyes. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then finally, a quiet voice. I don't know how to come back from this. I sat beside him. Not to fix it. Not to offer hollow comfort, but to be there. To be present. You don't need to come back, I said. You just need to come through. And slowly, he nodded. Broken, but not alone. People didn't leave all at once. They lingered, uncertain, unsettled. Like they were hoping someone would stand up and say, that was a rehearsal. The real wedding starts now, but no one did. The reception was never announced. The buffet remained untouched. Even the cake, a 3-tier vanilla almond masterpiece, stood like a frozen monument to everything we didn't say sooner. Some guests huddled together, whispering their own conclusions. Others gave Gabe long, quiet looks, not of blame, not exactly, but the kind adults give when a child becomes the messenger for something no one else had the courage to reveal. I saw 2 of my father's colleagues debating in low tones near the piano. One of them, a man named Frank, retired Navy pilot, sharp-witted, deeply loyal, approached me. His tie was still neatly knotted, his posture straight, but his eyes were soft with concern. Felicity, he said, almost gently. You knew? I met his gaze. Not everything, but enough. He frowned. Then why didn't you stop it? I breathed in slowly, weighing how much truth he was actually asking for. Because he wouldn't have believed me, I said. Not then. Frank's face pinched. He might have, I shook my head. He was in love, Frank. He wasn't hearing logic. If I'd come forward, he would have thought I was jealous, or grieving, or bitter. Frank opened his mouth to object, but then paused. He knew I was right. And Gabe, he asked, how did that boy end up being the one to pull the trigger? I looked across the room at my son, who was sitting on the floor by the hallway, knees tucked under his arms, still alert, still watchful. Because he saw what adults refused to see, I said. And he trusted what he heard. Frank exhaled and placed a hand on my shoulder. You raised a good one, I nodded once. I tried to raise a listener. He offered a small, respectful nod, then turned back to his circle of old friends. I knew they'd keep talking, turning it over, trying to find a narrative that made more sense than what they just witnessed. Others weren't so generous. A woman I barely knew, my father's former neighbor, I think, murmured loudly as she passed me. Honestly, this feels orchestrated. She waited till the last minute to play hero? Why not speak up earlier? Another guest, this one more openly critical, looked me up and down and said, it's a cruel thing to let a man propose marriage just to humiliate him in front of everyone. I didn't respond to her. Some people don't want answers. They want someone to blame. But the one that stayed with me most was a quiet man in his 70s. He was a friend of my father's from his early teaching days. I remembered him from childhood visits. He used to bring chessboards and speak in quotes. He came up beside me and asked simply, why now? There was no hostility in his tone, just pain. The kind of pain that came from seeing your friend collapse into himself after believing in someone who never existed. I gave him the only answer that ever mattered, because she had to reveal herself, not me. He didn't nod, didn't blink. You knew he wouldn't believe you, he said, not as a question, but as a recognition. He needed the truth to come from her mouth, I said softly, or he would have rejected it. There was a pause. Then he said, I think he still will. And he walked away. That's the thing about moments like this. They divide people into those who want to face the truth and those who prefer a comfortable lie, even if it's shattered. Half the guests walked out dazed, their opinions shifting by the minute. The other half? They stayed behind to find someone to judge. Gabe eventually stood up and came over to me. His eyes weren't tearful, but they weren't proud either. Did I do the wrong thing, he asked. My hand reached for his without hesitation. No, I said. You did the hard thing, and that's not the same. He looked down, then said, some people hate me now. They don't, I replied. They hate that a child did what they couldn't. He nodded slowly, but the words didn't soothe him. That night, in the silence that followed the evacuation of what should have been a celebration, I thought of every time I had bitten my tongue over the past few months, Every time I had wanted to say, something's wrong. This woman is not who she claims to be. But I stayed silent, not out of fear, out of precision, out of necessity. Because sometimes, truth delivered too soon just bounces off the walls. It had to come from the source, and today, it did. Not in anger, not with vengeance, just a voice on a recording. And a boy brave enough to press play. The house was quieter now. My father had moved into the guest cottage behind mine, closer than I ever thought he'd want to be, but he hadn't resisted when I offered. He just nodded, picked up a single duffel bag, and walked toward the car without another word. It had been 3 weeks since the wedding, that wasn't. Since Interpol took Irina Vlasenko, Anastasia, away in a car so ordinary it made the moment feel even more surreal. Since guests stumbled out of the venue half whispering, half judging. Since Gabe stopped asking me every night whether he'd done the right thing. It had been 3 weeks of quiet evenings. My father hadn't brought it up once, until tonight. He came in without knocking, he never did anymore, and poured himself a small glass of water. He leaned on the counter, looking older than I ever remembered. Not tired, just aged. His hands rested on the counter like he was waiting for permission to speak. I set down the dish towel and nodded, wordlessly. He looked at me and said, "You knew." I didn't reply, just gave him the space to keep going. His voice was low. "How long?" There was no accusation in his tone, only the kind of bewildered sadness you don't bother disguising with pride anymore. I dried my hands, turned to face him fully. "Since the hiking group." He blinked. "That early?" I nodded. She introduced herself as a grief counselor, but she never asked me anything about Mom, not once. Just told stories, half about herself, half about Russia. He sat down at the kitchen table, glass in hand. But that could have just been her way of grieving. "Yes," I said gently. "It could have." He waited a moment before asking, "So when did it stop being just a feeling?" I leaned against the sink. The first time she corrected Gabe's pronunciation of a Latvian phrase. He looked confused. "She claimed to have studied in Riga," I said. But she mixed up 2 simple words, kakis and kaka, in a way no one fluent ever would. His eyes dropped to the table. "You never told me." "No," I said quietly. "Why?" I poured myself a cup of tea. Let the silence stretch, because some answers need a moment to settle before they land. Then I said, "Because if I had told you then, you would have defended her. You would have thought I was jealous, or overly protective, or still grieving Mom." He didn't deny it. Instead, he looked at the steam rising from my cup and asked, "So you waited for what? For her to hang herself?" "No," I said calmly. "I waited for her to reveal herself. To you, not to me." He let out a long breath. "And she did." I nodded once. He looked up again. "And Gabe?" "He found the recorder," I said. "He connected the dots. I warned him to stay back, but he wouldn't." He closed his eyes. "God, my grandson had to unmask my fiancé." "No," I said softly. "Your grandson protected you." He looked down again. "Do you hate me?" I blinked. "What?" "For believing her, for falling for it, for pushing you aside." I walked around the table and sat across from him. "No," I said. "I don't hate you." "You should," he whispered. "I don't," I repeated. "Because I know what it's like to want to feel alive again." And she was persuasive. He looked up. "You're being kind." "No," I said. "I'm being truthful." He stared at me for a long time, then asked, "So what now?" "Now," I said, "you get to take long walks, make bad jokes, complain about Gabe's taste in music, be a grandfather, heal, and maybe one day, trust again." He nodded slowly, and for the first time since she was arrested, I saw the edges of him soften. He stood up, walked to the door, then turned around. "One more thing," he said. I raised an eyebrow. He looked straight at me. "I'm sorry I didn't see her for what she was, but mostly, I'm sorry I didn't see you for what you were trying not to say." That was the moment something in me loosened. I gave him a small smile, tired, but real. "You see me now." He nodded. Then he left the way he came, quiet, gentle. No more walls. I stayed at the kitchen table long after the door closed behind him, letting that one sentence echo. Not for what it meant, but for what it finally made room for. I heard Gabe's door creak open, slow like a whisper. I was in the kitchen again, tea in hand, rain tapping the windows like it had something to say. He padded in, socks mismatched, hair unbrushed. He didn't say good morning, just sat across from me and stared at the tabletop. I waited. Silence is a language when you know how to listen. After a long pause, he said it. I ruined it. I didn't ask what. I already knew. I ruined Grandpa's wedding. I ruined the moment. I humiliated him in front of everyone. I humiliated her. I didn't even give her a chance to explain. I sipped my tea. You didn't ruin anything, Gabe. He shook his head, shoulders hunched. I thought it would feel like justice, like I did the right thing, but it didn't. It just felt bad, like I broke something that didn't belong to me. I set my cup down and looked at him. That feeling you have, that ache in your chest, that's called conscience. And it's not a punishment, it's a gift. It means you didn't enjoy hurting someone, even if what you did was necessary. He blinked fast, holding something back. I just wanted to protect him. And you did, I said gently. You did what adults twice your age would have ignored. You noticed the cracks. You followed the trail. You had the courage to act when it mattered most. You weren't reckless, Gabe. You were brave. But he looked so broken, Gabe whispered. Like I took something from him. Like I made him old overnight. I took a breath. Sometimes truth does that. It doesn't always feel like a rescue in the moment. Sometimes it feels like betrayal, especially when the truth exposes something we didn't want to see. He looked up at me. You weren't mad at me for stepping in? No, I said without pause. But I was afraid. His eyes widened. Afraid of what? That you'd stop seeing the world as safe. That you'd start questioning the kindness of strangers. That you'd begin to carry that weight, the weight I spent years learning how to hold. I stood up, walked to the cabinet, and opened a small tin I hadn't touched in years. Inside was a folded page, yellowed at the corners, wrapped in plastic. I set it in front of him. What is this? My field notes. Estonia. Ikibin Sekis. He unfolded it carefully, eyes scanning the neat lines of handwriting and code. I explained. I was stationed at a NATO base near Tallinn. I was supposed to observe financial patterns, routine surveillance, nothing fancy. But something happened. I nodded. I was in a coffee shop near the port. 2 men walked in, one local, one American. The local man asked if the flowers had bloomed early this year. Just a casual phrase, but it wasn't spring, it was January. And it was freezing, Gabe frowned. Code? Exactly, I said. They were using metaphor to signal a money drop, illegal, unregistered, and dangerous. That one sentence unraveled an entire laundering network. It got shut down within 72 hours. Gabe stared. But how'd you know it wasn't just poetry? I smiled faintly. Because the man who answered mispronounced the Estonian word "forsno." He wasn't local, he was pretending. He exhaled. So, one wrong word gave it away. Yes, just like with Anastasia, or Irina, one crack in the story. That's all it takes when you're listening closely. We sat quietly for a while. The rain softened. Did it feel bad, he asked, tearing down that operation, exposing people. I looked at him. Sometimes, yes, but not because it was wrong. Because it reminded me how fragile trust is. How much damage can hide behind polite smiles. He nodded slowly. So what do I do now? I thought for a moment. You rest. You let your heart breathe. And you let time teach you what I can't. He looked down at the field note again. Do you think Grandpa hates me? No, I said. I think he hurts, but not because of you. Because he trusted someone who didn't earn it. And that's not your fault. I just wanted to keep him safe. You did, I said. And someday he'll say that out loud. Maybe not today, maybe not soon. But he will. Gabe folded the note and handed it back to me. No, I said, pushing it back. Keep it. Let it remind you that your instincts matter. That truth has weight. And that even when it hurts, there's strength in choosing to see. He held the note with both hands. Okay. Then, almost as an afterthought, he whispered, Thanks, Mom. I blinked back something warm. No, I said. Thank you, son. And for the first time in weeks, he smiled. Just a little, but it was real. Gabe stood by the sink, rinsing his glass. The silence between us wasn't heavy, just deliberate. He was processing again, the way he always did now, quietly, methodically, like everything meant more than it used to. I watched him dry the glass and place it back in the cupboard. Then he turned. "Mom," he said, "do you ever regret not stopping her earlier?" His voice was calm, but I could hear the real question underneath. Did I wait too long? Did I let it go too far? I closed the folder I'd been reading and folded my hands. "Yes and no," I said. "I regret what she took from your grandfather. I regret the stress, the manipulation, the money that might never be recovered. But do I regret the timing of when she was stopped?" I looked him in the eye. Number, because if I had acted on my own, without proof, without patience, without letting her show her true colors, I would have made myself the villain in someone else's story. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "But you knew, way before everyone else. Doesn't that make it feel like you could have prevented more damage?" I nodded slowly. "It does. That's the burden of seeing clearly before others do. But there's a line, Gabe. A very thin line between revenge and justice." He tilted his head, listening. "Revenge," I continued, "is about release, about satisfying our own pain by watching someone else fall. It feels urgent, almost addictive. But justice is different. It waits, it watches, it builds its case not just to punish, but to protect." He was quiet for a while, then asked, "So you weren't angry?" "Oh, I was furious," I said with a soft laugh. "Not just for your grandfather, but for how easily someone like her could lie with a smile. But if I had acted on that anger, if I had gone to the police too soon, or tried to confront her without what we gathered, she would have twisted the narrative. I would have lost your grandfather, Gabe. Completely. He would have chosen to believe her. And we'd be standing on opposite sides of a battlefield I never wanted." He exhaled through his nose. "That sounds hard." It was, I admitted. But sometimes doing the right thing means enduring the wrong moments first. He came over and sat beside me at the table, his face more solemn than I liked seeing on a 13-year-old. "So what if she never slipped up? What if we never found that recording?" I looked at him. "Then we would have kept watching, learning, waiting, and maybe eventually she would have exposed herself another way. Or maybe we'd lose that battle. That's the risk of choosing justice over revenge. It doesn't guarantee satisfaction, just integrity." He rubbed at a spot on the table with his thumb. "But it's slower and harder." "Yes," I said. "But it also lasts longer. It repairs instead of destroys. Revenge makes a moment feel good. Justice makes a lifetime safer." Gabe looked at me, his voice low. I didn't want to be angry. I just didn't want her to fool Grandpa anymore. "And you didn't act out of anger," I told him. "You acted because you saw the truth and knew it couldn't stay hidden. That's not revenge. That's courage." He nodded. Then after a pause, asked, "Do you think I could have waited longer?" I thought about it. Maybe, but you made the best decision you could with the information you had. And it was enough. You didn't ruin anything, Gabe. You helped stop a dangerous person from continuing her cycle. I touched his hand. And more importantly, you learned the hardest lesson some adults never do. That truth without timing can be a weapon, but truth with wisdom. He finished the thought, softly. "It's justice." We sat there, the kitchen still except for the hum of the fridge. "You're growing up fast," I whispered. "Feels weird," he muttered. "It always does," I said. "But trust me, you're not alone. And I'm proud of how you handled everything." He gave a small smile, then leaned his head on my shoulder. And in that quiet, I knew, some battles don't end with applause. They end with understanding, passed from mother to son, like a torch lit in the dark. It had been a year, 12 quiet months, and yet they moved like the tides, subtle but full of change. My father started, laughing again, not the hollow kind. The polite chuckle he used to carry like a borrowed coat, too large for his frame, too stiff to feel like his. No, this time it was from somewhere deeper. Real. He started going back to the community center. They'd invite him to lead their Friday chess group. He'd smile, shake his head, pretend to decline, then show up anyway, holding the board under one arm like it was some old medal. He even won a community volunteer award in April. He didn't hang it in the living room, but I saw the folded certificate tucked behind the books on his shelf, right next to Mom's old gardening journals. Gabe visited him every other weekend. He didn't say much when he came home, but I could tell he didn't flinch anymore when I mentioned Grandpa. They had their own quiet rhythm now, like something had reset. Or maybe something real was finally allowed to grow. I don't know when Gabe started learning Russian. I just found a workbook in his backpack, Ruski Yazyk dla Начинающих, Russian for Beginners. There were sticky notes on the pages, phrases like, "What do you remember?" and "Tell me again." He never explained it. I never asked, but I understood. Maybe he wanted to reclaim something. Maybe he wanted to understand what she really said in that recording. Beyond the arrest, beyond the moment that stole his innocence too soon. Maybe this was his way of making sure that language couldn't trick them again. That truth, if spoken, would always be understood. And as for me, I started sleeping through the night again. It's strange the things you only realize when they return. I no longer jolted awake at 2 a.m. with that old instinct. Like something was slipping through my fingers. Like I was too late, always too late. That constant loop had quieted. One morning, I woke to the sound of birds. I stayed in bed an extra 10 minutes. That was the moment I knew. I'd forgiven myself. Not for failing to see, because I did see. Not for speaking late, because it was exactly when I needed to speak. But for carrying the weight of two people, for thinking I had to protect everyone. At dinner one night, my father brought dessert, tiramisu, from the same Italian place Mom used to love. He said it tasted almost right. I looked up, and for the first time in years, there wasn't guilt behind his eyes, just time. Time had passed. And we were still here. I told him Gabe was learning Russian. He laughed, really laughed. So he can interrogate future girlfriends. Maybe, I smiled. Or maybe he just wants to speak your language, all of it. That made him pause, just a second. Then he nodded and said, "I'll speak back." There were still days he didn't talk much. Days when I'd find him on the porch, just holding Mom's mug, now empty, tracing the rim with his thumb. But those days were no longer surrounded by silence. They were part of something, fuller, like pauses in a song, not the end of one. I finally let myself hang new pictures. One of Gabe in the science fair, one of my parents holding hands in Yellowstone, back in '92 when life was all denim and sunlight. And one from last month, the three of us, Dad, Gabe, and I, at the farmer's market. We're not quite smiling, but we're not pretending either. We're just together. And that counts. I didn't realize how deeply I had doubted myself until that doubt eased. Until the whisper in my chest changed from, "You should have stopped it sooner," to, "You did what you could, with love and with precision." I was a daughter, a mother, and once, briefly, a soldier again. Not with weapons or ranks this time, but with discernment, with patience. I didn't destroy Anastasia. She did that to herself. All I did was wait until the truth could be seen without needing to shout. That's harder than people think. Harder than revenge, harder than justice. It's faith. And I don't use that word lightly. But sometimes the most radical act of love is to say, "I see what's coming, and I will still let you walk toward it." Not because I don't care, but because I believe you need to see it for yourself. My father needed to see, and he did. Now he brings tomatoes from his garden. He makes small jokes. He asks if Gabe's growing taller than me. He remembers to check the mail, and every time he does, I remind myself, healing doesn't knock. It just enters quietly, and sometimes, if you're lucky, it brings tiramisu. The letter came on a Tuesday. It was in a plain white envelope, the kind you could mistake for a bill or a neighborhood flyer. But the seal in the corner, dark blue, stamped with gold, told me it was something else. Interpol. I didn't open it right away. I left it on the counter while I finished rinsing the dishes, while I folded the laundry, while I picked Gabe up from school. Something about it felt heavy, even before I tore it open. When I finally did, the words were simple. "On behalf of our operations division, we extend our gratitude to you, Ms. Hart, for your role in exposing the transnational laundering network tied to Irina Vlasenko. Your discretion and professionalism directly aided in dismantling one of the more elusive criminal frameworks in recent years. Her conviction, 12 years federal sentence, stands as a result of coordinated effort. Please know your vigilance prevented further harm. With respect, Interpol. I read it twice, then a third time. My fingers lingered on the word gratitude, gratitude, for a wedding that turned into an arrest, for a boy's courage, for silence turned into proof. But when I folded the letter and set it down, I didn't feel triumphant. Not really. Because the sentence, the 12 years, none of that mattered to me the way it probably should have. What I remembered most was not the courtroom, not the reporters, not even the foreign agents, shaking my hand. It was that single moment. Gabe standing in the middle of the chapel, his voice shaking, holding a black recorder like it was the only weapon he would ever need. "Grandpa, don't marry her." The sound of him saying that still lives in my chest. I can replay it word for word, tone for tone. I can still see the way the guests froze, how my father's hands gripped the chair, how Irina's perfect smile cracked in half. That was the moment the lie ended. Not when Interpol cuffed her, not when the gavel struck. It ended because a child spoke truth in a room full of adults too polite, too afraid, or too blind to do it themselves. I told Gabe once that courage doesn't always look like victory. Sometimes it just looks like standing up. He didn't believe me at the time, but I think he does now. When I showed him the letter, he read it carefully. He even smiled a little. But then he said, "They should have written my name." I laughed softly. Maybe one day they will. But between us, I knew the truth. His name didn't need to be written. It was already etched into the story that changed everything. My father has never forgotten it. He still tells the story to his chess group, though he changes the details every time. Sometimes he says Gabe outsmarted the bride. Other times, he says Gabe overheard a code. The stories shift, but the pride never does. For me, though, pride is mixed with something heavier. Every time I remember that day, I think of what could have happened if Gabe hadn't acted, if the recording had stayed hidden, if Irina had succeeded. 12 years in prison feels like a number. It doesn't carry the weight of what almost was, the destruction she nearly brought into our family. That's why I keep the recorder in a drawer, tucked away but never forgotten. Not as evidence anymore, but as a reminder. Because justice isn't the trial. Justice isn't the years marked on a judge's sheet. Justice is a boy refusing to let silence win. That letter from Interpol is still on my desk. I haven't framed it. I haven't filed it away. It sits loose, vulnerable, like the truth it represents. When people ask me how I feel now that it's over, I give them the same answer every time. It's not over. It never really is. Because the lesson doesn't end with her prison term. The lesson is that evil wears a smile. And sometimes only a child is willing to say, that smile isn't real. One night, Gabe came into the living room while I was rereading the letter. He sat next to me, swinging his legs, and asked, "Do you think she ever thinks about us in there?" I looked at him. "Maybe, but that doesn't matter. What matters is we think about us, not her." He leaned into me, resting his head against my shoulder. "I didn't mean to be brave," he whispered. "I know," I said. "That's what made it real." Outside, the night was quiet. No applause, no headlines, just a family sitting, together, alive, safe, still learning how to breathe again. And as I folded the letter back into its envelope, I realized something. History would remember Irina Vlasenko for her crimes. Interpol would remember me for my service. But I would remember my son standing in that chapel, saying words that shattered the lie. And the world? The world had no choice but to listen. The lake shimmered under the soft light of late spring. It was a place we hadn't visited in years, one of those quiet corners on the edge of town, where the trees bent low to whisper over the water, and the world felt smaller, softer, slower. I used to come here as a girl, alone with my journal and silence. Now I came with Gabe. We didn't talk at first. My father was a few steps away, crouched by a portable grill, humming tunelessly as he sliced baguette into even pieces. He had brought salted butter and a jar of strawberry preserves, things that felt impossibly simple after the kind of year we'd had. But maybe that was the point. Gabe sat cross-legged beside me, picking pebbles from the shore and stacking them in deliberate piles. His hair was longer now, and his hands looked slightly bigger, but it wasn't his appearance that struck me. It was the way he sat, shoulders straight, eyes scanning, not like a boy lost in daydreams, but like someone who had seen too much too soon. He didn't speak until the third stack of pebbles. "If I meet someone like her again someday," he asked without looking at me, "should I stay quiet?" I turned toward him, watching his face. His expression was calm, but behind his voice was something I recognized. Not fear, not guilt, but the weight of understanding, the burden of knowing what people are capable of. "No," I said gently, "but you should wait for the right moment. You should do it the right way, and you need proof." He looked at me then, eyes searching for the why. "Because when you speak the truth without proof," I continued, "they'll call it gossip, or bitterness, or jealousy. People don't like hearing things that make them uncomfortable. Even if you're right, especially if you're right." He nodded slowly. "What if they get hurt while I'm waiting?" My chest tightened. It was the question I had asked myself 100 times, in a dozen countries, in rooms filled with threats disguised as charm. "You don't wait out of cowardice," I said. "You wait to make sure that when you speak, the lie can't slither away." The grill behind us clicked, and the smell of crisping bread drifted through the breeze. My father called out, "Hot and ready, but not burned, for once." Gabe smiled faintly, but didn't move. His hands were still. He whispered, "I didn't feel brave that day." I reached out and took his hand, warm and dry with lake dust. "That's what made it brave," I said. "It's not courage if you're not scared." He leaned against me then, not like a child needing protection, but like someone sharing space, sharing silence, the kind of closeness that didn't need words to make it real. We sat that way until my father wandered over, handing us toasted slices with a grin. Butter and jam, courtesy of an old man who used to trust the wrong people. I took the bread, met his eyes. There was laughter in his voice, but no bitterness left. Just a tired kind of wisdom, the kind only gained after the ground shifts under you and you somehow keep standing. As he sat beside us, the three of us looking out at the lake, I felt something loosen in my chest. Not release, not closure. Those were tidy words for untidy truths, but maybe peace, a version of it. The world hadn't returned to what it was. It never would. But we were still here, together, and maybe that was enough. When Gabe finished his bread, he asked, "Is that why you didn't stop her earlier? Because you were waiting for the right time?" I didn't lie to him. "Yes. And because I wasn't sure your grandfather could take it from me. He needed to see it himself." He looked at the rippling water, then said, "I think I understand that now, but it still hurts sometimes, thinking about it." I wrapped my arm around his shoulder. "Some truths hurt before they heal," I said, "but silence can scar worse." He nodded again. He didn't need to say more. Above us, birds moved across the sky in slow arcs. The air carried the scent of pine and baked sugar, and the water lapped softly against the stones. In that moment, I realized something else. I hadn't failed him. Not as a mother. Not as a daughter. Not even as a woman who once stayed quiet longer than she should have. Because the boy beside me, he wasn't broken. He was awake, thoughtful, stronger than I had been at his age. And he knew something most adults still struggle with. That telling the truth is not about being loud. It's about being right and being ready. And when the time comes, you don't shout. You speak just loud enough for the world to hear. There's a certain silence that follows storms, not emptiness, but the kind of stillness that means something has passed and something else can begin. That's what I felt exactly 1 year after it all unfolded. Not triumph, not vindication, but stillness. I sat on the back porch of our house, legs tucked beneath me, a blanket around my shoulders, though it wasn't cold. Gabe was inside finishing homework. My father had fallen asleep on the couch with a book on his chest and a glass of unfinished tea nearby. And I was simply breathing. It had taken years to learn how to do that again without the weight of what-ifs. What if I had spoken too soon? What if I had waited too long? What if Gabe had never stood up? But those questions no longer haunted me, because I had my answers, all of them. When I looked back on everything from suspicion to pain to revelation, I didn't see a battle won through fury or force. I saw a small device hidden in a child's jacket pocket. I saw the way Gabe had stood up and spoken, even when his voice trembled. I saw restraint instead of rage, patience instead of panic. That was the win, not exposing Irina, but protecting Gabe's ability to trust again. You see, in all my years of military training, nobody ever taught me the most dangerous form of destruction is what happens quietly. When the wrong person earns your belief. Irina hadn't broken into our home with a weapon. She had entered with warmth, with charm, with lies wrapped in pretty words. And if I had shouted before I had proof, she would have survived it, twisted it, maybe even turned my father or Gabe against me, but I didn't. Because I had learned, both in war zones and family dinners, that sometimes the strongest defense is silence, strategic, unshaken, waiting not for the enemy to fall, but for the mask to slip on its own. And it had. Irina's conviction had come down 2 months ago, 12 years in prison. No parole for the first 8. Her financial crimes, stretching across 5 countries, had finally caught up with her. But I didn't feel elation when the news arrived. I felt a quiet, solemn kind of relief. A week later, a letter came from Interpol, typed, formal, but oddly sincere. They thanked me for my discreet support in identifying a Tier 2 transnational laundering network. They praised the clarity of Gabe's recorded audio. They enclosed a note about how his courage played a key role in validating the investigation timeline. I kept that letter in a drawer, not because I needed the credit, but because one day when Gabe is older, he might need to remember that even the smallest voices can change the course of something huge. But if I had to choose one moment to hold on to forever, one memory that defines this entire chapter of our lives, it wouldn't be that courtroom, or the headlines, or the prison sentence. It would be the moment Gabe stood, when he placed his small hands on the table, cleared his throat, and said, "She's lying." The air had gone still. The guests had stared, my father had turned pale, and Gabe, my Gabe, had not run. That's the real ending, not the fall of a con woman, but the rise of a boy who found his voice. And as for me, I learned finally that being a soldier had never made me brave. Being a mother did, because soldiers are trained to fight battles, but mothers, we must choose which ones matter, and when to wait. That night on the porch, I closed my eyes and whispered the words I never said out loud during the whole ordeal. Words that aren't flashy or heroic, but that feel like the truth. Victory isn't when you expose the villain. It's when you protect the ones you love, from the kind of hurt that lingers long after the threat is gone. That was my mission, not revenge, not justice in the papers, but safeguarding Gabe's softness, his hope, his ability to look at the world and still believe in something better. And now, before this story fades behind the next, I want to say something to you, wherever you are. Before we say goodbye, we'd love to know, where are you watching from? Is it a quiet morning with a warm cup of coffee? Or a late night where stories like this keep you company? Let us know in the comments. We read everyone with gratitude. And if this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel, not just to hear more stories like this, but to be part of a community that still believes in kindness, healing, and second chances. Thank you for spending your time with us today. Wherever you are, we hope you carry this story with you, and remember, sometimes the miracle doesn't knock on your door. It waits quietly until you're ready to open your heart. Take care, and we'll see you in the next story.